Awesome. You have your microphone?
Yep.
Okay. Does this stay?
Yeah.
Okay.
Just gotta stay plugged in.
Cool. Well,
You switch it back to OBS so I can see what is happening.
yes. We need to
I
move our
only have
camera
half
a
my
little.
head.
Okay.
All right. That's
That looks like a Brian.
not bad.
Cool.
Cool.
Okay. Hi, everyone.
Hello.
Thank you for waiting.
Took a little while to get set up, but it now works.
We had to set up the
Oh, wait. I got to grab one more thing.
Okay.
Yep. I don't know if this is going to sit properly.
Whoa.
It's messed up. Okay, attempt number 2. Okay, now it's time. For real this time. You can move that one if it's in the way.
No, that's fine.
Oh. This is a critique I was working on yesterday, in case anybody's wondering. And the student was asking a lot of questions about eye sockets. That's kind of what it focused on for the most part. And yeah. So this is kind of how the critiques work, right? Like basically students send in drawings, kind of like this, and then I print them out, and then I tape them up here, and then tape some tracing paper over top, and then I kind of work on top of their drawing and answer any questions they have and talk about what could be done differently and how things could be designed a little bit and made to work better, hopefully. So that's kind of the idea. So we're going to jump in here and tape up a new one.
Oh, I want to say also.
Yeah.
We have Romaine.
Cool.
We have Olivia, Arbitrary Live.
Oh yeah.
And we also have Evie, who's joining the stream. I'm not sure about Olivia, but she might be in Europe. But I just wanted to say welcome to her. I don't think we've seen them in our streams before.
Welcome everyone. Romaine and Olivia and Evie, welcome to the live stream. Okay, so let's get one of these set up for real.
And Mia.
And Mia. So I'm going to take this one down. You guys are going to get to see some behind the scenes stuff here. So this is the first one, and it's actually a really nice drawing. I think you did a good job. The only thing that stands out to me is a little bit off, possibly, is things just feel a little bit exaggerated, right? Like your value control is pretty good, and rendering's not bad. I mean, but I don't know, we can work on that later. Mostly what I'm seeing is things just feel very exaggerated compared to the reference. Put this down here. And like the eye feels a little bit large. But honestly, that doesn't really bother me too much. I have a tendency to draw large eyes myself, so I don't know. But the nose is very exaggerated and very bumpy. And when I look at her nose in the reference photo, it's not really bumpy at all. I mean, there's a little bit of bumpiness to it, but it's very subtle, right? So that's what we need to be careful with. And then the shape of the head overall feels too long and a little bit too, I don't know, like the angle of the jaw feels a little bit off maybe. And her jaw feels a little bit flatter. So that's kind of having the effect of taking her face and kind of like stretching it out a little bit. And then the thirds, I think, might be a little bit off. So if we come in here and check, and her face fits that third breakdown really well. So if we go from bottom of the nose to here, no, actually that fits pretty well. I take it back. So I think it's mostly just adjusting the shape of the jaw down here. And what's going to happen is as we adjust that shape and probably angle it this way a little bit more, it's going to shrink how much space we have for the face and hopefully kind of push things back into proportion a little bit. So let me get some tracing paper set up. I just crushed my tracing paper. This one did not survive, unfortunately, but this one did. Also, I didn't have time to sharpen a pencil beforehand, so if your pencil looks like this, you should probably sharpen it. I'm going to go ahead and use it because I've been doing this for a long time and I can do it, but man, as a student, if I tried to use a pencil like this, it would not work well. Just so you know. Because I used to go through the same thing where instructors would always tell me, like, sharpen your pencil, and then I'd watch them do a demo with like the worst sharpened pencil ever, and it would look amazing. And I realize now that it takes a long time to build the dexterity that you need to do that. Okay, so let's figure out what's going on here, right? The shape of the head needs to change a little bit to kind of fit her head shape a little bit better. And then we're gonna have to take all the features and kind of squish them into that new shape. Because right now the features all feel very large, you know, and like the lips are a little bit large and exaggerated, like the shapes, you know, the nose. We'll have to just kind of like tone everything down a little bit. And what I'm seeing is very typical for, you know, like student, even advanced student type work, where usually what happens is you start getting really focused in on specific things, right? And you start looking at this and saying like, gosh, I'm going in there and I'm like trying to figure out exactly what's going on with that nose. And then it ends up kind of like too exaggerated in comparison to everything else. And to avoid that, we want to like really simplify things at first and keep things really simple and just limited to like C curves, S curves, and straights. And that's about it, right? So for the big shape of the head, right, her head's kind of sitting back here. We'll kind of start with that cranial mass type shape. She's going to sit kind of somewhere back in here, right? Now, one thing I'm noticing is this cheeks is sticking out pretty far, right? Almost even with the brow or like past it just a little tiny bit. And in the reference, I'm not seeing that. Like I'm seeing more of the cheek kind of sitting back a little bit farther, and the side plane of her head really kind of wraps back this way a little bit more. Kind of drops back like that. You know, so we'll have to kind of pay attention to that. And then the shape of the jaw is going to be a little bit different. And it sounds crazy, but to be honest, this step right here of creating the big shape of the head is possibly the hardest part of the whole thing, in my opinion. And that sounds weird because like it's just like a few lines, but those lines are so important. They're like critical to getting all of this to read properly, right? So now notice I'm adjusting the jaw and kind of changing the angle of it. Because when I hold my pencil up to the reference, the angle of the jaw is more like this, right? So that needs to like kind of shift and change quite a bit. So we'll come in here and see if we can kind of figure out how that's going to connect like that, right? And so we're going to bring this up, and notice what we're doing is kind of shrinking the size of the face a little bit now. Get rid of some of those construction lines. So that's feeling a little bit more like her head, I think. The ear and the jaw kind of sit back here. That's in a pretty good spot. Right, and then we'll kind of find some of, well, the center line, right, is going to be good to have in here, which is going to be way off to the side over here, coming down kind of like this. Now, what's tough is with the head wrap, we can't see where the brow line is, or like the hairline, right? We can't see exactly where the hair is, so we have to guess a little bit. And my feeling here is that, like, if we duplicate this distance up this way, your hairline is like way up here. It's not bad. That might be correct. But we're going to have to change it a little bit just to fit our new head shape here. Right, so the hairline is going to sit kind of up above the change in plane of the forehead, or in her case, kind of like right on it maybe. So let's say it's going to sit up about here, right? And so that's going to be the space now for the face, right? It's kind of between here and here. And then we take that space and break it into thirds. And you did that really well. It was just on a head shape that didn't really match her head exactly, you know. So let's see if we can find a brow line. Maybe we're gonna have to move it up a little bit, probably. Move this up a little bit to kind of fit our new head shape. Measure these and make sure everything's reading properly here. Boom, boom. It's pretty good. Those thirds look pretty good. The lines that I drew aren't super level. Maybe they're okay. I don't know. Right, so we kind of find those thirds, and then we can come in here and start looking for how to break down the rest of the head. And at this point, like, it depends on how much construction you want to put in. If you have a little bit more experience, we can just kind of put minimal construction in, you know. But really, if we want to, we can kind of look for where the side plane of the head is going to sit, probably somewhere around here, right? So we're kind of seeing like that separation of front plane and side plane. And that means we're going to have the side plane sitting over here, right? Kind of like that. You know, start getting some of that Loomis head type look a little bit. I think the ear was in a good spot. We can keep that there. Ear for right now, I'm just going to keep it nice and simple. Just keep it as like an oval, because it might need to move. You know, we want to keep our lines very, very simple at first. As simple as possible. That's why we want to stick with C curves, S curves, straights. Because when we screw something up, we want it to be really easy to change. Because there's always this tendency where you'll get kind of focused in on one area and work on it and work on it. And then it'll end up being wrong, but the tendency will be to not want to change it because you spent a bunch of time on it, and you'll start changing stuff around it to try to make it work. When in reality, to make it work, you just have to redraw that part. And so that's partly why we want to keep our line work very, very simple during the construction stage. You know, and then it's during like rendering where things get really complicated. So once we've got this here, we can come in and start looking for kind of like where that glabella shape is going to sit. Kind of in here. Inside of this eye socket, sits kind of back in here. You know, and then the way her brow sits almost kind of comes up a little bit. Kind of like that, and then wraps around the corner of the head out here. Right, kind of like that. Same thing over here. We get this side kind of popping up this way a little bit. Just kind of like a long eye socket shape. You know, but again, look at the lines I'm making, they're very simple, right? Every single mark that I make is literally either a C curve or a straight. That's it. I mean, that's not to oversimplify things, but that's, when it comes to mark making, that's kind of the big secret. Right, kind of find the bottom of that eye socket. Right, now the nose, you know, because you did a pretty good job finding your eye sockets and eyes. The nose, though, is so exaggerated that we're going to need to tone that down a bit. And notice I'm not drawing this section quite yet, because the way this area interacts with the nose is going to be really important. And so I'm going to kind of draw both of those at the same time a little bit and see if we can figure out how to just put a nice sweep for the nose. Just judge the angle. Say, okay, it's going to come down this direction, right? Kind of like that. And I can kind of double check this angle a little bit. pretty good. Right? And then we get maybe the tip of the nose just ever so slightly different. Just a little tiny bit. We cannot exaggerate this, especially during the construction phase. And it depends on your goal. Like, obviously, if you want a more exaggerated look, then you exaggerate it more. But for training purposes, I would recommend not exaggerating too much, right? Like, a little bit is probably unavoidable to a certain extent. And but try to minimize it. If anything, we want to simplify things and make them more simple, right? Rather than more exaggerated. Which in a way is kind of exaggerating also. I mean, for being honest, we're kind of like exaggerating in the other direction. So that nose is going to sit right about there. I don't know, it needs like a little bit more of a tilt to it. Maybe that's good. Right, then we're going to come in here and find this brow shape, which is kind of sticking out this way. Right, kind of coming out, wrapping around, and down here. Right, and then we get the eye kind of overlapping the far side of the eye socket, which actually you drew that really well. I mean, I'll change this shape a little bit to kind of match her brow shape a little bit more, but the way you have the overlaps working, the way you have the dimensionality of the eyes working, I mean, a lot of that works really well. You know, it's more about just how to keep things from getting too exaggerated, right? So we're going to have a very simple eye shape in here, and then we get a little bit of cheek, just ever so slightly, coming out kind of like this way. And even then, I put a little bit more there than there is in the reference, but I think it's fine. Trying to keep it very simple. You know, and then we get the cheekbone, or not the bone, but the cheek itself kind of wrapping out and around. Notice drawing through the form, not worrying about drawing right through that nose, because we need to make sure everything lines up properly. Then we can kind of pull that part back out. Then we're going to take this bottom section, break it into thirds. We've got nose line here, chin down here, and then we'll break this into thirds. Here, here, kind of like that. Measure these, make sure it works properly. Boom, boom, that's pretty good, right? And so now we have to consider the tooth cylinder, right? So the tooth cylinder is pushing the lips forward, and they're kind of coming out and wrapping around that tooth cylinder shape. So the center line for the lips is going to be different from the center line of the overall head. Right, so this is going to kind of pop out and wrap around. Kind of this way. Again, just a nice simple C curve. And then the chin is going to kind of pop back out here. Sort of turn into this type of shape. You know, and then we have to design the lips accordingly and make sure that they conform to that, you know, tooth cylinder type center line. Which is probably a good place to start. So we'll kind of start working our way back up.
What question to ask you here?
Yeah.
Or to read to you?
Okay.
This is from Adam Hill.
Okay.
Adam says, I'm having a really difficult time with your eye sockets. I don't see the same angles. Which reference points should I be using?
Oh, that's a good question. So they're asking about, you know, the eye sockets and saying they're having a hard time with them. And to be honest, that's probably the question I get the most, because they're really tough and it took me a long time to kind of figure this stuff out. So don't feel bad if it doesn't make sense, because it they're probably, aside from just getting the big shape of the head like just right, eye sockets are definitely the hard part, right? So essentially what I'm looking for here is first this line for that we call the brow line, right, is running right through where the eyebrows meet, right in the center of the forehead, right? So there's like an eyebrow starting right here and an eyebrow right here. That's kind of like right where they start, and that's what I'm running that line through. The hard part then is that there's so many different ways that the eye sockets can work, and depending on the person and the head type and their skull, like everybody's going to be a little bit different. So there's no like one correct solution necessarily. But what I'm looking for here is basically looking for first the big shape of the head, right? Where is our front plane versus side plane of the head? And then the way that I do it, and what's different from kind of what Loomis does a little bit, is I look for more like the corner of the head, which is right here, right? Which is going to be like if we were thinking of this as a box, right? And we came in here to draw this box. And let's say here's our, we got like a boxy shape here. Right, so here's a box. And we're thinking of this a little bit as a head, and we're saying like, okay, we want to break this into planes, right? So we have an obvious side plane and a side plane here, right? And that works pretty well. But the problem is the head isn't that simple, right? It's not actually a box. It's like a weird kind of like rounded hybrid type box shape. So really what's happening here at the corner is this is the area where it's rounded, right? So the forehead, like the corner of the forehead here is rounded a bit. And so we're actually seeing more of a rounded shape here. And maybe down here a little bit, right? To round out those corners. And then that ends up creating another situation. And this is kind of more what Loomis looks for, right? Is notice what we have now is now we have a kind of a flat section here, and then a rounded section here, and then another flat section over here. Right, now Loomis, when you watch Loomis, or I guess you can't watch him anymore, but read Loomis or look at the book, what he's looking for when he draws like this circle, he's looking for the flat part of the side of the head, right? So he's just using like this part out here essentially, and he's saying like this is the flat part of the side of the head, and that's kind of what he bases everything off. For me personally, trying to just judge exactly where that sits is almost impossible. I had a really hard time with it. Still can't quite do it. I mean, I can do it if I take the time to construct the whole thing like this, but just trying to do that right off the bat is really challenging, right? So instead what we have here is, first I found the boxy shape. Then the rounded part of the brow right in here wraps around the corner, right? Is kind of like this rounded part. And then the flat part of the side of the head is actually in here and sits back here a little bit farther, kind of like this, right? And then, so that's kind of more what Loomis would draw. This is kind of like more like where the actual corner sits. And then there's a flat spot for the forehead out here, right? There's kind of like another flat spot out here. And so then what happens is we basically get like a flat spot for the forehead, and then it wraps around this corner here and then down this way. Right? And that's kind of my breakdown. And then I apply that to the eye socket, right? So we have kind of like a little flat part, wraps around the corner. And then what's tough is depending on the person, this is going to look very, very different. Some people have very flat brows, right? Some people have very angular brows. Some people have very rounded brow shapes. Hers are kind of like in between, right? Like there's kind of like a flatter angled part here, and then it's very rounded out around here a little bit, you know? And what we end up with here is essentially kind of like something that looks like this, right? So let's draw another box. And again, this is a highly kind of simplified version of things here. This other box on here. All right, say we've got a box. And this box is going to represent a head. What we're looking for is, let's say we've got like a center line in here, right? And say this is, of course, the front of the head. This is the back, right? Our brow line is maybe doing this and then kind of wrapping around. And what we're trying to do is basically remove a wedge from the box, right? And so what we're going to have is like a little bit of that glabella shape, the inside of this eye socket, and then we're trying to remove a wedge, right? So it's going to cut back into the side plane a little bit, and then it's going to do the same thing in here, and then it's going to cut back out, and it's going to cut back over here. And essentially what we're doing is literally just cutting a wedge out of the box, right? There's maybe a little center line. Boom, boom. Right, and so we've literally taken a wedge shape right, kind of like that, and like literally just pulled it out, right? So it's, but it's tough, right? Because again, the head isn't a box, right? So it's this concept, but then we're taking that concept and bending it and applying it to something that has more like a rounded corner and a more complex shape, right? But you can see that that's still happening here, right? Like this wedge is still removed. It's just changed to fit the eye socket shape a little bit more. Now, what people then usually ask is like, well, how do you know where to put the bottom parts of the eye sockets? Truthfully, it doesn't matter all that much. You just like, honestly, you could even get away without drawing the bottom of the eye sockets. It would probably be fine. It's just kind of a bad habit. And the way that I was trained, like you always want to draw complete shapes. Like you want to be in the habit of drawing complete shapes because that's like an important concept when it comes to drawing. And so these lines down here don't really end up in the finished drawing, right? Like this is kind of more like, I don't know, this would be like really careful rendering sort of. Like this isn't like a major construction type thing that you need necessarily. It's more about creating and drawing in a way where, say, if I had to stop right now, something happened and I was like live stream over and I stood up and walked away, this would still look like a relatively complete drawing. Like I could post this on Instagram and it would look pretty cool. And the reason for that is because I'm kind of going in and completing my shapes, you know, and just kind of drawing in a way where everything is like each step of the drawing is kind of like its own little finished drawing is kind of the idea. But what I've done over the years is when I find this side plane, what I've noticed is when I go to create this little bottom section, I just kind of use that to help align where this stuff is going to go. And it works pretty well. Is it totally 100% correct? No, not really, but construction-wise it makes sense. And logically it kind of makes sense. And I don't know, when it comes to like a finished drawing though, it's not super important where this is exactly. From there, then it's a matter of just continuing to break things down and to understand like how do the eye sockets actually work, right? So remember this brow line right here, this is basically where the brow bone protrudes out the farthest, right? It's not actually the opening of the eye socket. It's where the bone sticks out the most, you know? So like if we look at like a quick little head from the side, right? We say here's hairline, brow line, nose line, and then chin, right? What's happening is this brow line right here, right? Which is this line. What's really going on here is that's where the brow bone sticks out and then pops back in. And the glabella is like here, like down underneath that line. And then our nose is going to stick out like this way, right? Kind of sticking back out there. We get our tooth cylinder and chin, right? But now what's going on with this line is that our eye socket now kind of sits back up in here. But the actual opening of the eye socket itself sits kind of like underneath there a little bit, right? Because there's actually like some bone in here, right? Because this isn't, you know, the actual opening sits just below that a little bit. And then it depends on the person too, right? Which really complicates things is that, you know, some people have really thick brow bones, some people not so much. Some people, this line, right? So you'll see me draw this a lot of the time, or pretty much all the time, which is now I'm looking for the actual opening of the eye socket itself and a nice rhythm to tie that together from side to side right in there, right? So now we have the actual thickness of the brow bone, right? So like the bone itself is kind of coming out. We had a little contour line kind of wrapping back in, and then the eye sits kind of like down in here. And then we hit kind of like this little bottom section, which is really just muscle draping over the eye socket. So that's the thinking. But again, it's really tough because every person you draw is going to work a little bit differently, right? Like some people, this line would run right up into our brow line, and they have kind of thinner brow bone sections. Some people, they have thicker brow sections. Some people have more angular sections, some more rounded. I don't know. There's just so much variety. Anyway, that's my eye socket. I can't talk. Eye socket explanation. Hopefully that helps. I know it's complicated. Part of it really is just practice, and what I've noticed is usually everybody has to develop their own understanding of that stuff to a certain extent. You know, like it's one thing to watch me do it and copy those lines, but until you've done it enough times that you can start to really make sense of it yourself and in your own way, that's when it'll really start to make sense and start to work a little bit better. Okay, so let's find a good lip shape. Running back that direction, and then coming back through here. All right, lip kind of runs right in there. Features are tough. There's something that just take a lot of practice. Excuse me. Sorry, we've been having super dry weather lately.
It's so dry.
It's extremely dry. I know it's weird because the rest of the country right now is having this polar vortex thing and they're all freezing. And we're in the one part that's having like the exact opposite weather. It's like hot during the day and super dry and horrible. Probably better than being frozen though.
Definitely.
Yeah. Okay, so then we'll get the lip kind of poking out from behind here. Something like that maybe. I don't know. Those lips look a little bit exaggerated, if I'm being honest. It's not, probably not the greatest lip shape ever. Let's do it this way. But notice I'm still sticking with that idea of simple lines, right? Every single mark that I make is literally either a C curve or a straight. That's it. Even S curves, like, I mean, usually that explanation involves S curves, like C curve, S curve, straight. But if you think about it, an S curve is really just two C curves, right? So like if you're including S curves, then you're really just talking about C curves still. I'm going to shrink this lip a little bit. You know, making sure those overlaps work properly. And then we get the cheek kind of dropping back behind here. Getting that little bit of overlap in there, which, to be honest, my pencil isn't sharpened well enough to do as perfectly as I want, but I want just that little bit of overlap to help show some depth. And then the chin just kind of pops back out. That's more or less what I would do. So you can see like the major differences here is really just about exaggeration. I mean, yeah, I changed the big shape of the head. That was part of it, right? To match her type a little bit better. Because that's part of what was going on, was that head shape was too long and the jaw too angled, you know, and she has like a flatter type jaw. But aside from that, you know, making everything kind of conform to the new shape, it was really about just simplifying things and not trying to exaggerate quite as much, and just being really, really careful with my mark making and trying to figure out. And then once you have this, if you look at it and you decide like, you know what, the nose does have a little bit of bumpiness to it, or it needs to be changed just ever so slightly, then we would have to go back in and really, really carefully change it up. And just add, maybe round this part out just a little bit. But it's such a subtle little change, right? Like, we don't want to exaggerate stuff. When you're learning to do this stuff, you want to keep things as subtle as possible, because subtlety is key to getting this stuff to work, you know, and it's hard to control. It's very easy to exaggerate things. Very difficult to simplify them. You can see like how small that change is that I just made. Round this out maybe just a little bit, you know, and it starts looking a little more like her nose. But man, they're just such careful little changes. All right, get this kind of like opening of the nostril sitting in there. So that's pretty much it. Honestly, you drew really nice eyes. I don't think we need to go into the eyes a whole lot. It was more like about the big proportions and just getting everything to read, you know, more like her, and in a way that's a little bit less exaggerated. And I know it sounds weird, but that big head shape that you start with is so critical. And yet it's such a challenging thing to get right. It's something that used to frustrate the heck out of me as a student, because it was a really difficult thing to master. And once you start getting the hang of these head shapes, everything else seems a little bit easier. And yeah, from here, I mean, we could keep going, but I'm going to move on to the next one because it's been a while. What time is it?
It is.
Oh, almost. It's been a long while. Oh. Okay. It's the world's longest critique. But I would just basically pick a line to help kind of align the eyes and stuff. Anyway, let's do a different one.
Oh.
Just disappeared.
Here we go. This reminds me of the Led Zeppelin man.
The Led Zeppelin man. I don't know who the Led Zeppelin man is.
He looks kind of like that. It's like a guy with huge wings. That's kind of like a nude guy.
Oh, that sounds cool.
Yeah.
Led Zeppelin man. Okay, so here we've got a figure invention by Romain. I think this was Romain's.
I think so.
So let me tape this up real quick. Romaine, if you're still watching, now is the time.
We have a follow-up comment from Adam Hill.
Okay.
Who says, thank you for taking the time. That helps a lot.
Good.
Awesome.
I'm glad it helps. Glad it helps. Those eye sockets are so tricky. I mean, to be honest, what's always frustrating, and when I was a student, was like, I would watch those explanations, and then I would watch the instructor draw it, and when you're watching it, it makes so much sense, and you're like, of course that makes sense. Of course you do it that way. But then when you try to do it on your own, it doesn't work, and it's all frustrating, and, you know, so if that happens, it's not just you. It happens to everybody. And it takes a lot of practice to get past that point because there's just drawing is so complicated. Like there's so many different factors involved. It's part knowledge, right? First you have to know what are those lines? What do they represent? How do you change them and move them around? You know, but then there's also like your brain's ability to just judge proportion and train your eye to see things properly. And then you're dealing with like dexterity and the ability to move the pencil in a way that makes sense. And the whole thing gets really complicated really fast. Okay, Romaine, you are up. Also, I'm going to drink this Coke while I work on your drawing. Delicious Coca-Cola.
Not yet our sponsor.
No, but I'm working on it.
Soon.
I'm going to get free Cokes for life. It's going to be great. Okay, so when I look at this, the first thing that stands out is he drew a really cool torso. I like that a lot. This leg, though, to me feels small, right? The foot feels small. The ankle feels too small. So I think we need more leg space down there. The arm works pretty good. I might change up some of the little overlaps in this area, but it's a pretty good arm overall. Decent hand. I like the hands. We'll have to see. This, I think, also is probably a little bit small, right? Because like the torso and the upper half feels pretty good. You know, very proportional, except the head also feels a little bit small. The features especially. Yeah, we'll have to make the head a little bit bigger. We need to make sure it doesn't feel like it's falling over. That's kind of what I'm looking at right now. I'm trying to look at it and thinking like, does it feel balanced? I think it does to an extent. I'm not sure. It might, I don't know, it might be like weighted a little bit too much on this side. I'm trying to think about what to do about that. It could just be that we need to make this leg a little bit larger and bigger and make it feel heavier to kind of like balance it out. But let's go in here and see what we can do. So the first thing I would do is make the head bigger because it feels very small, right? So let's come in here and see if we can get a nice head shape. Kind of a better size here. More like that, maybe. I can zoom in here. Right, that center line would be kind of like up here, maybe. He's got his head turned a little bit, so we kind of have to account for that. I'm not going to spend too much time on the head other than adjusting the size, because like you drew pretty good little features and stuff on there. They're just on a head that's too small, you know? But what you drew in there I think looks pretty good. You have some cool little like pointy ears that I like. And so this is tough, right? Because we got to figure out, okay, what's going on with the neck? And I like this, right? Kind of, it's swinging back this direction. And we're getting this part kind of pulled in here. That makes sense. And we're kind of getting this part probably compressed back into this area a bit. And we can add some compression in there later. We can go back in there and change that up if we need to. I'd be tempted, like, once I work this out, to possibly even shoot some reference real quick, because it's a tough neck angle. Right, so then we've got kind of the sweep of the collarbone, and then in this case his arm's being raised up, so the pec is probably coming up over the collarbone a little bit here. So we've got like the pit of the neck, collarbone kind of coming up along this way, a little bit of collarbone probably coming out over that way and disappearing. Right, then we get the pec kind of coming up and over, wrapping around the shoulder here, up over the other side. And that arm up position is tough to draw. It's always hard. It takes a lot of practice. So one thing I'm noticing is like this side of the pec over here feels small to me, considering how much we're seeing here. It just feels like it needs to be larger. So we'll work on that in a minute. Let's get the rest of this gesture on here for this arm. Right, it's going to kind of come out this way. A little bit of shoulder on here. I think is probably good. Right, let's see if we can find a nice center line. I like that you really pushed it, right? Like you kind of pushed the gesture here a lot, which is good. Right, kind of finding that center line. And then we're gonna have rib cage in here somewhere. Probably back up under here. And then we can kind of figure out what's going on with the hip. And it's tough. So it seems like the hip angle is going this way, right? And yet he's got all his weight on this leg. But it's possible. You can pull the other side up. I mean, it's not like this is like an impossible pose, but is it the best possible pose? I don't know. Let's try it, right? Let's see what happens if we push it the other direction a little bit here. Right? Maybe we take this hip section, kind of push it the other way. All right, we kind of find that boxy shape of the hip, although, to be honest, I don't like that shape a whole lot. Right, so we have kind of that boxy shape, and then we're going to have we'll have to come in and figure out how to connect it all up. And then we can have the gesture for this leg then kind of pulled down this direction.
Can I read you a couple comments real quick?
Yeah.
This is from Romain. So he initially first said that he has found it harder to draw facial features on a smaller head. That makes sense.
Yeah, drawing facial features on small heads is hard. I mean, what's tough really is just the scale, because like it works the same way, but it takes a lot more dexterity, because you're working so much smaller. I mean, you got to really get in there and work everything out on like a really small level. But then at the same time, what's tough is you have to simplify more, because you can't put the same level of detail in. So we practice these big head drawings, and when you go to draw the small ones, suddenly you're having to like actually simplify things even more and leave a lot of information out, really.
It's almost like an opportunity for like a style choice.
Yeah.
And then I just wanted to read you a second comment, which is the initial thought was that he was taking off. So the idea behind the pose is that he's like taking
That's cool.
off.
Yeah. In that case, if he's taking off, I don't know. I think this makes sense. Yeah. What I would do is a little bit, what's I think a little bit awkward And it's not to say that this is impossible. It's not really wrong. It just feels a little bit awkward to me, which is the entire torso is facing at an angle this way and this leg, but then you have this foot and leg coming straight at us. Now, we can bend our leg that way. It's not like it's an impossibility. But I don't know. There's something about it that still just feels a little bit awkward, you know? So like we can come in here, and what I would do is maybe take this leg and bend it a little bit more and try and angle it. Also, it's going to need to be bigger. Right, kind of like this. Get this other gesture coming down this way. Right, coming down like that. And then what I'm going to do is take this foot and kind of change it a little bit. Right, so it sits kind of like that. Or what we can do, if he's taking off, like, 'cause that feels like he's planted on the ground. And this too also feels like it's really planted on the ground, right? And that's partly, I think, why it didn't have the feeling of him quite flying up in the air. We could take this leg and, or this foot, and kind of do this with it maybe. Kind of bend it down this way more. You know, and then show that, you know, the ground is like down here. I don't know. That's a tough foot to draw with no reference. You know, but really kind of show that it's like starting to lift off the ground a little bit maybe. And then I think, in my opinion, I don't know, and you feel free to disagree with this, because it's not like the leg that you drew is angled in like a totally impossible way. It just doesn't quite fit the overall gesture of the whole thing, right? And then same thing out here. I'm going to move this leg down a little bit, right, to kind of fit our boxy shape.
He says that foot makes way more sense.
Good. Right, and then I can do this. Right, I think we're going to need a bigger leg over here as well. Right, and then kind of see if we can complete our gesture here. Coming out that way, down this way. Right, so now we've taken this leg and kind of turned it a little bit. So now this knee is sitting like out here maybe. This one looks pretty good. I like this leg. I think that works fine. Right, maybe it's coming towards us a little bit. Right, then we're maybe kind of looking up at this part a little bit, kind of down at this part a little bit. That's not bad. I think that's working a little better, right? So the proportionally, like, that feels more in line with what I'm seeing on the top half, because you drew this awesome torso and then the legs were a little bit small. You know, and so then from here we can come in and start breaking down the torso a little bit more. I like this. I like that you bent this to kind of fit that cylindrical shape of the torso, and you got the pec kind of wrapping around that shape, and then we can get the rest of the gesture for this arm on here. Right, kind of coming down that way. A little bit of, right, the latissimus, and then we hit some rib cage, and then we get oblique kind of popping out and kind of grabbing onto the box. Right, same thing out here. We're going to have a little bit of this rib cage showing. Well, here we can kind of find a nice rhythm that we can wrap the pec around, right? And then we have that little bit of rib cage popping out, kind of right in there. And then we'll come in and find how those abs connect. And you drew pretty decent abs, right? And I even like that you got a little bit of that overlap happening right in here where you're seeing like that little bit of oblique on the other side. In fact, I might push even a little bit more of that, right? Because those abs are going to kind of basically wrap this way, and then we'll get a little bit of oblique kind of coming out over there and grabbing on. The rest of this inguinal ligament on here. And this part. Oh, also a little bit of adductors. And then this part. Sits right about there. That to me, proportionally, I think makes a little bit more sense in terms of like legs to torso ratio and the slightly larger head. Although I made him a little bit thinner. You don't have to do that. Your guy's is more muscly than mine. You know, maybe get this gesture for this other arm on here coming out. This way, and then I'd be careful, make sure, well, I don't know, it's not too bad. Let's just make sure that we get a nice rhythm on here. Make this arm a little bit bigger. I don't know, this is a terrible hand shape. I don't want to get into the hands. The hands that you drew are pretty cool. I don't think we need to spend too much time messing with them. Right, but I do want to make that forearm a little bit larger. It feels, it's hard to say. Like it could be leaning back in towards us a little bit. In which case, right, like it's kind of doing this. And like this. Right, let me get kind of that wrist shape up in there, and then this part's maybe coming towards us like this way a little bit. You know, that makes sense. But I would still make this a little bit bigger maybe. Just feels a little bit small. Again, invention's tough because we don't have like a common goal to work from, you know, which is kind of what the reference is for. So it could be that, you know, you intended for that arm to be leaned towards us more, and that's why it was smaller. And then I'm going and making it longer, you know, so just keep in mind that it might not work out perfectly. I think we can make this arm a little bigger as well, right? Shift this hand out this way a little bit. And then we're going to have, again, like cylindrical forms. I feel like this arm's coming towards us a little bit. Let's see if we can build up some of these forms in here. See if we can get that thing really feeling like it's coming at us, you know. And then we have like that wrist shape, a little boxy shape for the wrist up in there. And then we can start kind of piecing things together. and saying like, okay, now we've got some scaffolding here, and we can kind of find some of the bicep poking out along here, right? And then we get the pec. Wrapping up along here. Right, kind of like that. And then we get this far pec. Coming way out here. I think we need it wrapping around there and really pushing this little overlap right in here, I think is going to help it feel like it's wrapping around the other side, which you kind of start having that, but I think pushing that more makes it feel more dimensional, kind of. You know, overlap is that thing that really adds depth. And this could be a little bigger maybe. Start kind of finding that forearm. Same thing down here. It's going to kind of come out, back in a little bit of elbow maybe, and then much bigger tricep type shape kind of sticking out there. And, you know, we could get more stuff. I mean, we can always add more detail, like figure out where that brachialis is coming out of, or the coracobrachialis, I guess. But you did a good job with that, right? Like, I don't think I need to go in there and redraw all this stuff because you did pretty good. You know, and then we've got, of course, the lat coming around here, and that's actually going up into the armpit. Up under there. Right, and then we've got the serratus. I mean, all of this you drew pretty well. I don't think we need to redraw it all. Serratus popping out here. You know, and then that kind of leads to our oblique coming out, kind of down around there. You know, we can design out those abs if we want. There's usually kind of that bigger section up top, and then kind of like this smaller section, and then the bigger section down on the bottom. You know, and so I worked it out pretty simply. And then we just go add more detail on there as needed. All right, like this part's going to wrap around, cut up, and then down, and then back up. You know, kind of wrap right in through there. Same thing down here. Boom, cuts around, up, down, up. You know, then the belly button sits just under that part. Yeah, from there, I mean, we can go in and throw some more detail on the legs maybe. And keep in mind, I mean, I changed this leg quite a bit, but the detail you have on this one, I think works pretty well. You know, like we could maybe just add a little bit more rectus femoris on there, a little bit of bone, a little bit of knee shape on there. Right, we need some hamstring. right? So we've got to have the hamstring down here, and then the sartorius kind of wrapping through like that direction, which I don't know if that's the best way to do that. You know, and then once we have that gesture worked out, of course, we'll come in and add the calf. You know, and then maybe a little bit of like the tibia sticking out here would be good. And then, of course, we get tibialis anterior, and that just kind of sweeps down into the leg. You know, same thing out here, right? Now that we've twisted this leg, now we have to think about, okay, well, your anatomy was pretty good. You got vastus medialis, lateralis, you know, I see some rectus femoris. I mean, it's all there. Now the tough part is how do we get that to read with the leg twisted around this way a little bit more? And that's a good question, right? So we'll have the knee right about there. We'll have the sartorius coming down here, and then the medialis popping out and overlapping this stuff a little bit. Right, kind of like that. And then on this side, of course, we get probably a little bit of gluteus maximus, a little bit perhaps, medius, I don't know. A little bit of hamstring, or not hamstring, but maybe a little bit of vastus lateralis kind of poking out on that side. And then there's tendon that's going to kind of be pretty straight right in there. You know, and so that's coming down and connecting to the head of the fibula, because that's actually is coming from the hamstring. I don't know if you guys can hear the trash truck, but it's doing its thing outside. Right, now we can add a little bit of tibia. Just a little bit of the tibia poking out there. And then see if we can build our calf coming out here. Right, kind of like that. And then we get a little bit of like calf kind of on this side probably. Right, a little bit of ankle. Don't like that ankle. Try that again. It's a little better. You need to be bigger and lower. Yeah, anyway, that's pretty much it. And Romain, hopefully this helps. You can kind of see what I'm going for here. To be honest, even on mine, these legs feel a little bit small compared to the top half. I think you can make this leg even a little tiny bit bigger, and I think it would still work pretty well. You know, we can maybe find a little bit of bicep in here.
I'll read you a comment from Romain here.
Okay.
He says, "This is great, Brian. I took a lot in just watching you draw over it. We'll keep practicing drawing figures, especially legs and feet." And he said earlier that he's learning legs at the moment.
Good.
And he says, "Thanks so much."
Romain, you are welcome, and I mean, you did pretty good. I mean, yeah, the legs are certainly probably the weak area, but I mean, if that's what you're working on and studying, then I don't think that's going to stay that way for long. You know, I mean, you drew a really nice torso. The upper half worked really well. You know, it was just a matter of designing out that lower section and just thinking about, you know, like And again, it's not like what you drew here was impossible. It's definitely too small, but in terms of it being turned towards us, I mean, our leg can do that. You know, it just doesn't, it just feels a little bit awkward. You know, a little bit awkward, and then everything just kind of needed to be larger. Larger and a little bit bigger. And small heads are tough. I know, I actually would agree with you there. Especially if we're talking like an invented head. It's hard to say because what I invent is probably going to be different from what you would invent. But we have, you know, hairline, same breakdown. Brow line, maybe try and make it look like we're looking up at him a little bit. Right, like he's up in the air. Gave him kind of like pointy ears, which is cool. Do my best Spock ear. Kind of like that. Let's see if we can get kind of a nose shape on here that looks like we're looking up at him. Also, to be honest, my pencil is not sharpened well enough to draw a head this small. This is very challenging. I don't know. It would fit right in there somewhere. And give him hair? Yeah, he's got some hair. Got some like cool, chaotic hair. I don't know. This guy does not feel like it fits the rest of the drawing. I like the head you drew. The head you drew is pretty good. It just needed to be bigger. I'm not trying to like tell you should draw the features differently because they have a nice little look to them. Also, I have to sneeze. Oh God. Sorry.
I know. I'm the same way today. Well, it's my turn. My turn to sneeze.
Yep.
Excuse me.
Time for sneezes.
Sorry, listeners. Especially headphone listeners. Sorry about that.
Anyway, I don't know. That's not the best head. You can ignore that head. But this is kind of the idea for the rest of it. Is slightly different legs, a little bit bigger legs, and hopefully a foot position that doesn't make him feel planted on the ground quite as much. I will hopefully create that feeling of him taking off a little bit more and flying up into the air. As far as the wings go, I mean, you drew pretty cool wings. To be honest, I don't know that I could just invent wings right now. I'd have to look up like feather patterns and see how that actually works. Wings aren't something I draw very often. And but there's a lot of really good people out there that draw awesome wings. I mean, finding some good good wing reference. Shouldn't be too tough. Yeah, so trying to think if we should do one more. What time is it? 12:24. So I did print out one more, which was a student drawing, and this was from a critique I was working on last night. And hopefully he won't mind if I use it.
Do you need some tracing paper?
I do, actually.
Here you go. Do you need anything to cut it with, or?
No, I can make it work. I had enough, and then I crushed one of them by accident.
Okay.
Yeah, one of these got super crushed. So, you guys get to see some behind the scenes activity. This is Foundation Art School, BTS. Yeah, here's how I cut my tracing paper. It's very exciting. As you can see, it is not a very precise process. It's more quick and rough.
I feel like it'd be cool for you to walk through like your book collection and other model collection and stuff.
Be cool. We can do that.
I find it interesting.
I'll make you a video then. Okay, so this one was, an invention, so there was no reference to go along with it, but I think I did get some reference ready for this next one, but Olivia has to go swap it out.
What do I need to do?
Just go over to OBS, yeah,
Gotcha.
and then just turn on that top reference thing.
Okay.
I hope I put the censored one on there. I hope.
Oh no.
Let's try it. Hit the little unhide thing.
Which
Up
one?
the very top. One more up. There you go. Little eyeball. Yeah.
You did it.
I did it.
Whoa.
It's
that
super
was
censored.
dangerous.
I know. Because then the one on my laptop is the uncensored one.
Oh, gotcha.
You got to make sure you put the right one in the right spot. YouTube apparently is very picky, as we have learned about how you censor these
worried
things.
about this one.
It could be an issue. We'll find out.
We will find out.
I mean, I went with the black bars this time instead of the blurring.
Yeah.
Because we had some issues. We finally got monetized, which was cool. And then they were like, oh, by the way, most of these aren't monetizable because they have naked people. It was like, oh, well, that sucks. So
they were censored, but just not enough.
yeah, and what's weird is like some of them were fine. Like there's this little like challenge button and you can like request a review, And so I just did that on a bunch of them to see what would happen. And what's weird is like some of them got approved and they were fine, and then others not, but they were all kind of censored in the same way. And it was all the male ones that they didn't approve, and like the female ones I challenged were okay. I don't know what's up with that. I don't know what YouTube's deal is exactly, but I'm not a fan of nudity apparently.
Thank you from B.A. Humdinger.
B.A. Humdinger.
I'm
That's
not
cool.
sure who that is. Well, it's B.A. Humdinger.
Yeah, I mean,
What
it's
do I
right
say?
there.
Let's see. As far as if they're a student or if they're new, just like
I don't know.
YouTube watcher.
I've seen that name before. I think they've either commented on Instagram stuff or been in the live stream before, one or the other. But I recognize the Humdinger part. It's very memorable.
Yeah. We have a comment from Isaiah.
Isaiah, welcome.
He says, I noticed it makes a huge difference when you have intent for the drawing. For example, the last one was taking off.
It does,
off
yeah,
sides.
yeah.
And he asks, do you ever just draw to draw, or do you always have a purpose or point being made?
I'm weird. I don't draw just to draw. I should. I know I should. I should have a sketchbook. I tell everybody, like, you gotta have a sketchbook. You gotta, like, play around with this stuff and invent stuff. But I just spend most of my time teaching, to be honest, at this point. Like, I don't spend a lot of time doing other stuff. But that's kind of intentional, because that's what I like to do. So it works out well for me. I don't know. I mean, I guess that's the answer.
Yep.
No, I don't spend a lot of time drawing other stuff. Maybe I should. I don't know. But I don't. Okay. What am I doing here? Critique. Oh, I know what I was going to do. I was going to show everybody what I shot last night. Because usually, like with the classes, with the way I run the classes, especially like this quick sketch, this was from a quick sketch class. You know, like I'll do the demo, and then I'll give the students like a whole bunch of extra photos to work from. And the idea is, you know, you should try to draw all of them if you have time, because it'll force you to start doing some of your own problem solving. You know, it's one thing to just watch my demo and then try to do what you saw me do. And that's a good way to learn at first, but over time you have to start really forcing yourself to start solving some of these problems on your own. Because the problem is when you watch the demo, you're watching my problem solving, and I'm basically doing the problem solving for you. And again, decent way to learn, but at a certain point you have to start pushing yourself and figuring out like how to force yourself to start solving those problems on your own. And that's what the other pieces are reference for. So what I'm getting at is, a lot of students will turn in more than one thing, right? Because they're drawing all those other pieces of reference. But when I'm doing the critiques, there's usually only time to do like one draw over per person. So I'll just kind of talk about the rest of them real quick and then just do the one draw over. So like this student turned in multiple things. I mean, there's even a couple more on the ground. This is the one that I chose for the draw over, right? And then this was like one of the extra ones. So I figured I would throw this in today and talk about this one a little bit. But this was kind of like the critique I did last night. And just talked about like the gesture and the overall flow of the whole thing and trying to get her to lean back far enough. And, you know, make sure it doesn't feel, you know, how the joints connect is really important, and making sure they kind of like flow into each other and that we use the tendons properly to help do that. You know, a lot of cool, interesting stuff. And yeah, I don't know. That's the idea. So I figured since we only had a couple people turn things in to be included in the stream, I just picked one of these other ones. And hopefully that's okay. So let's see what we've got here. So when I look at this, especially for a quick sketch, this is pretty good, right? Like quick sketch is not an easy thing. It's tough. And I don't know, this works pretty well. There's some things I'm noticing up in here, right? Like this overlap right in here, that works well. But then we have this overlap here, which is a little bit awkward. You know, it's awkward to have them kind of both overlapping the same way on each side, even though she's turned away from us a little bit. It's a little bit awkward. Aside from that, the overall shape of the torso feels pretty good, right? The legs, though, could use a little bit of work. And part of that, I think, is coming from maybe a lack of anatomy knowledge, you know, because there's things about the knees that we could add in here that I think would really help a lot. Part of that is going to be understanding like how the tendons on the side of the leg work and how we can push a straight right in here to help kind of link things together. We can get a little bit of the tibia showing in here. And there's a lot of little things we could add real quick that I think will make a big difference. And so I'm going to go in and try and figure those out. Figure out where to start with this one. So let's see. So I'm going to drink a little bit more Coca-Cola, which is very delicious. Yum. Okay, so we need a head, right? He's got a decent head shape up here. It's quick sketch, so you could just use a little oval for the head. That's fine. Nothing wrong with that. Right, neck's kind of sitting right in there. This head, honestly, the oval I just made might be a little bit large. I might need to shrink that a little bit. We'll see. Part of the reason we want to just start with an oval is to keep it easy to change, right? So if I get halfway through this thing and I'm like, dang, the head's too big, all I drew was an oval, so it's not going to be hard to fix. Right, so we get kind of our oval, her arm, right up along her head here. Coming down this way, we need a good width. She has very thin limbs, which kind of makes things tough, right? Because it's very easy then to go too thin, but then it's also easy to make them too wide. I mean, they have to be like just right. And I think the elbow could sit a little bit higher. I don't know, it's going to sit right up around there. Now, this is challenging here. So we have this arm kind of swinging down into here. Got a little bit of shoulder out here, just starting pretty high up. It's kind of like out here, but it's very subtle, right? Very, very subtle kind of shoulder shape on there. Remember, subtlety is one of the keys to getting this stuff to read really well, and it's also one of the hardest parts of this whole thing, right? So then we've got a little bit of the pec coming up over here, and a little bit of like the collarbone kind of popping up a little bit, back down. And then her other shoulder is like back behind there. It's kind of disappearing a little bit. So before I draw too much more of this, right, I think we need to get like a center line and just like a gesture for the whole thing. Like that's a good little starting position. But let's figure out what's going on with the gesture here, right? So it's kind of coming out like this. Now we're going to use a plumb line. Make sure that gesture or our center line is ending in the right spot. Seems pretty good. Come right down there. The pubic bone, I think roughly is going to sit around here somewhere. Couldn't tell you exactly right now, but it's going to be about there, right? And so now we have to decide, how do we want to handle this gesture for the torso, right? Because it's kind of an awkward, really awkward. I mean, it's not an awkward pose. It's a really cool looking pose, but to draw it is a little bit awkward because we can't see this shoulder. It's like dipped way back there. So like, what do we do? And I think what we need is a little bit of this rib cage in here, right? Coming out here, and then I'm just going to kind of keep this gesture like this, and then on this side, it's going to come down this way, and we're basically creating the kind of like flower sack type look, right? So there's like, if you ever look at like animation books, they talk about this like kind of like flower sack type shape. That kind of does this, right? And there's center lines like out here, right? We're basically creating something like that, but it's just modified to fit her a little bit more, you know? And then we get kind of the other hip sticking out. Kind of out there. And then we need the rest of our gesture here for the legs. And it's going to be a little bit tricky, right? So I'm going to use like an S-curve, I think, for these legs. And it's tough, right? Because her leg's straight, and what's really tough here is it really depends on the person and the leg type and the pose and the angle of it. Is it straight on? Is it turned a little bit? These are turned a little bit. But honestly, there's times where in this situation, I'll do exactly what the student did, which is 2 straights for a leg gesture. Like I'll do this frequently, you know, and use that as a leg gesture. But for some reason in this case, to me, it just looks like a C curve is going to work better, or an S curve. right? And have it kind of swing down this way a little bit, and then kind of back this way and down into the foot. And the key to get these S-curves to work is to not exaggerate them too much, especially the lower part. It's critical. I mean, if you exaggerate this too much, that leg will break very fast. I keep wanting to make a video about that because I don't want to explain why, but I'm going to make a video about it eventually. Right? And so then we just kind of duplicate our S-curve here. And again, with gesture, what we're looking for is length and width. Right? What is the width of the connection point of the leg up here, the width of the knee, the width of the ankle, and finding common lines to kind of align each of those points. And then that's going to swing down into this foot, which I'm going to make a little bit longer. You know, it kind of sits like right down in there. And then I'm going to do the same thing for this other one, right? Nice S-curve, although I might start with the foot just to make sure it aligns properly. The heel kind of lines up underneath the ankle. So that actually feels about right. And it's sitting at an angle kind of like this. Right, now we need our big gesture. Sweeping around this way. Back around this way. And again, when it comes to these curves, do not bend the bottom part of the S-curve too much because it will break the leg very, very easily. It takes a level of subtlety that has to be handled just right. Other foot sitting down here, right? Kind of complete our gesture. A little bit of heel. A little more narrow. I think that's a good starting position. Yeah, that looks okay. Then we can work our way back up to the top, start adding more stuff, right? And start figuring out like, okay, remember there's like a boxy shape in here and her hips, she's turned away from us and there's a little bit of perspective in the photo. So we're getting this hip shape in here, kind of sitting like this. Right, it's kind of sitting right in there. These shapes are a challenge, right? And you'll notice, in this case, I'm sort of adding it after the fact, right? But if this was more of an invention, understanding how this box works would be really important, right? So then we get the inguinal ligament, which kind of sits in here. What's up?
Got some comments and questions.
Okay, comments and questions.
Yes.
Got them all.
Quickly, Romain says he's got to go, but thanks for the critique stream and have a good one.
Romain, you're welcome. Thanks for watching. I don't know if you're still here or not, but thanks for turning something in. I appreciate it because I wouldn't have had anything to draw otherwise.
Awesome. And we also have a comment from Isaiah following up on the previous comment.
Yeah.
Or question, which is, or maybe just commenting on what you're saying, but he says, so for example here, did this model have a prompt or a suggested pose, or is she just posing dynamically on her own? If not suggested, are you thinking of a backstory, or is it mostly just deconstruction or construction and design of the pose itself?
Basically, there was no prompt or anything. When we do photo shoots, I usually just let the models do what they want to do for the most part.
Yeah.
I try not to direct them too much because as soon as you start doing that, things get stiff and they're always like, you mean like this, and you end up with poses that are more stiff, and like every model kind of has their own style and their own poses and their own things, you know, that they do. And so I try not to direct them unless something really looks off. Like one thing is in this pose, right? Like a lot of them do like the arms up type poses, which look cool, but as you know, an instructor, like I need more than just arms up poses. So usually most of my direction is just telling them to like put a hand down on their hip or something. Like it's not very much. And then what I'll usually do is they'll do a pose and then I'll shoot it from like 3 different angles real quick. And then, you know, and then we just end up with a whole bunch of photos and I go through them and pick out all the good ones and that's what we end up with. And so it's different though, like if I was going to do an illustration and I needed reference, then of course, like it would be much more directed because I would need something really specific and I would show them my sketch and be like, okay, here's the sketch, here's what we're going for. You know, you need to be like reaching out at the camera or something doing this, you know, and then we'd have to work with it and get it all like just right. But for the figure drawing classes, I want it to be more natural, you know, and have them in poses that they're comfortable with and isn't like too awkward. And so usually you just let them do their thing. And unless something really looks off, then I don't direct them too much. That's just me. That's my own figure photo shoot philosophy. Some places will direct them a lot more. Okay, let's see what's going on here. We've got, is that it? Was there a second question or was that it?
That was it.
That was it. Okay.
Yeah, that was it. It was basically, yeah, just asking if it's like, if the pose means something, like they're actually doing something, or if it's just a dynamic pose.
Oh yeah, it's just a dynamic pose.
Yeah, and then also, yeah, like if as you're drawing, are you usually thinking of a backstory, or if you're just purely focusing on construction and design? I feel like in your teaching method, it's mostly the latter.
The way I teach, it's purely like construction design. You know, like what I teach specifically is more geared towards like beginning to intermediate level students, you know? And so that's where you really need all the construction and design stuff. And then as people get more advanced, I mean, we don't have a ton of like illustration classes or anything yet. So really I'm trying to set everything up so that people can study here, get all the fundamentals and construction stuff down, and then go study at like a place like CDA or Brainstorm or something like that and really work on, you know, figuring out what to do with this stuff. That's like kind of the idea.
Storytelling and the composition.
Yeah, and picture making and stuff like that. Yeah, exactly.
Whereas like, if you try to work on all that stuff first, like the storytelling, picture making, composition, but you don't know how to draw a good figure,
it's going to be frustrating.
Like a backwards way to work on your skills.
A little bit, yeah. Yeah, and it's not to say that you shouldn't do any of that stuff. Yeah. It's more like a proportional thing, right? Like when you're first starting out, you need to spend the majority of your time studying this type of stuff, this figure construction, you know, perspective. You probably need to learn how to do some buildings and cars maybe a little bit, depending on what you want to do. I don't know. I mean, but if you want to go into illustration, you're going to need to know perspective. And even just doing this requires a certain amount of perspective. So, you know, you have to start out hammering those fundamentals over and over. And then so you'll spend maybe like 3/4 of your time on like the academic stuff. And then like maybe 25% of your time on just drawing in your sketchbook and coming up with little like illustration ideas or doing little thumbnails, you know, and just kind of like playing around with that a little bit. But it's going to be hard. It's not going to work well at first. Then over time, as the academic stuff starts to make more sense and you get better at it and better at it, then you start kind of transitioning your time over more towards like picture making and composition and less academic type stuff is kind of the idea. You know, so then you're spending, maybe eventually it reverses and you're spending like 25% of your time doing academic stuff and the other 3/4 of your time you're doing, you know, studying picture making and things like that. But that's kind of the idea. Make sure this ends up in the right spot here. Notice for the breasts, I'm kind of starting with oval type shapes, but the breasts are not ovals, right? Like, it's just like a placeholder. Kind of get everything in the right spot. And then we'll have to go back in and modify them and figure out how to change them to kind of fit better what we need them to be. You know, so kind of lighten it a little bit. And in this case, we're looking up at her a lot, right? So we're actually seeing like the top of the breast kind of wrapping around like that. And then it's kind of wrapping around the roundness of the rib cage a little bit. You know, kind of like that. And then on the other side, we get a little bit of chest and then breast. And that breast is wrapping way around the rib cage over here. And then we have to show that overlap very clearly, right? Like we get rib cage definitely overlapping that breast. Right, kind of sitting up in there. And then bottom of the rib cage. Right, on this side we can add a few more details maybe, right? Because up here we had the shoulder, I put that in. But then we're seeing some of the shoulder girdle muscles and maybe a little bit of like scapula or something kind of poke out here a little bit. Probably add a little bit of that in there. And then we get rib cage down in here. Right, kind of like that. Although, don't like that. This space feels a little bit small compared to the reference, but I think it'll still work okay. You know, and then over here we're getting this overlap, right, where we get the oblique kind of popping out. And it sort of comes over and grabs onto the box right there. Right, same thing here, we're getting abs kind of dropping down this way, and then oblique kind of popping back out, grabbing onto the box down here. Right, kind of like that. And so you can see I changed up the overlaps in this area quite a bit, and maybe even added a little bit more perspective to it, because I don't know that we're actually seeing this overlap in the reference. Like, I think she's turned just enough that we're not quite seeing it, so I'm kind of like adding it back in a little bit. And the reason for that is because, remember, overlap is like our key, or one of our key tools to show depth. And so kind of pushing that perspective just a little bit and pushing those overlaps is going to add a lot of depth into that area and kind of help people see what's going on. Right, and then of course the abs continue down this way, continue up along this way, kind of keep going. Yeah, that's kind of the idea. If we need to, we can come in here and find the rest of that rib cage shape. Right, kind of dropping down there. But she's like, you know, she's not like a bodybuilder or something, so we don't need to put that much detail in there. We could, you know, I could keep going and add more detail, but then it's not going to look like her really. You know, it's going to look like a superhero version of her or something. So for the legs, we mostly just need to figure out like, okay, where are the knees going to sit? And to be honest, I'm just going to kind of take my best guess here. I'm going to say Get a knee right about there. The other one's gonna sit a little bit of an angle, up a little bit, right about there. And so there's something that our body can do, which is always looks a little bit awkward in a drawing. And what's tricky is it looks right in the photo, right? Because our feet and legs can do this, but then when you draw it, it's always a little bit awkward. And that is that we can bend our foot different ways without bending our knee, right? There's a certain amount of like, I don't know. Let's see if I can show it. I don't know if I can do this. I don't know if, it's not going to fit. I was going to try and get my foot on the screen, but you can bend your foot, right? But your knee stays in the same spot. So you'll see models do that a lot. And that's kind of happening here, where the knee is kind of pointed at a little bit of an angle, but the foot's coming right at us, you know, which is a little bit awkward. It's not very extreme. So we could draw it the way it is, and I think it'll look fine. But some models will really push that. And I think it comes from like ballet or something, because a lot of models are also dancers and like ballet people. And so you'll see like, you know, you'll see the foot and the knee kind of facing one way, and then you'll see the foot like kind of going the other way, and it can look kind of awkward. And sometimes you'll have to learn to recognize that, because what's weird is when you see it in the photo, it reads fine. Your brain just accepts it. It's like, oh, this is a photo of a thing that happened, and your brain is fine with it. But then when you draw it in a drawing, even if you get it to look just like the photo, it'll look wrong. And so you have to kind of be able to recognize when that's happening and when it's not, and kind of adjust accordingly. Okay, let's see here. We've got this kind of coming around this way. We get a little bit of the medialis kind of poking out here, wrapping around the side of the knee. This knee is kind of tucked up in here a little bit. Right, kind of like that. Now, like I was saying before, what we need here is to show a little bit of the tibia sticking out. Right, so we'll get a little bit of this like straight that pops out down here and then connects back into here, and it's that little bit of tibia that's going to add a lot of like kind of dynamic overlaps and things into that area and add some solidity to it, right? It creates a situation where we can push some straights, you know, because we want to use straights wherever we have like a bony type area. Out here we're going to have some glute, right? And then we're going to have a little bit of, not even sure it's the lateralis. It might be a little bit of hamstring or something poking out, but it's very subtle.
Can I read you a question really quick?
Okay.
This is from Ryden Williams.
Ah, Ryden, what's up?
Yeah, Ryden asks, so the crotch is below the box?
Yeah, so with the box, like there's a very specific way that I use it. I mean, you don't have to do it the way I do it, because there's a lot of different ways to do it. But for me, the box, the bottom part of the box right here is the pubic bone, right? And then like the actual like genitals themselves sit just below the bone, right? And so, yeah, they would like kind of like attach to that part of the box, sort of. So like if we draw the box, let's just get a nice, sorry, make sure that's on the screen. Get a nice box on here. It's a little bit of an angle usually. Right, so there's our box. Right, to me it represents very specific points, right, which is going to be the corners of the box or just inside a little bit. Somewhere in that area we're going to have our ACES points, right? Depends on the person. It could just be the corners. It works fine. But those ACES points are those points on the pelvis that like stick out, right? Those little points on the front. You can usually feel them on yourself. You know, it's basically, it's the ACES, which is ASIS, ASIS. That is terrible handwriting, but it stands for anterior superior iliac spine. And that's basically these little points here. And those points are important because a ton of muscles connect up into those points, right? So we need to be able to identify those. Then what I'm kind of doing with the box really is kind of chopping some of the iliac crest off. In reality, the iliac crest probably comes up higher, kind of like up there. And I'm kind of chopping that off a little bit, which works fine for construction purposes. But depending on the person, you might need to put them back in if it's like somebody that has really wide, kind of tall hips. Then this bottom part of the box represents the pubic bone, right? So, or I guess it would be the, what, pubis symphysis? Symphysis pubis? Something like that. Little part that fuses together at the bottom of the pelvis, right? So that would actually be this little section. There's like that little bone right there. And then it's got like that little like fusion kind of. And then we're leaving off the ischium altogether, right? So you have kind of like there's like kind of like two parts to the pelvis. There's like the ilium and the ischium, I think. And the ilium's like the upper part with the iliac crest. The ischium is like those little bony parts that hang down below. But we can't see those, right? So we don't need them. So the box just kind of ignores those entirely. And so what happens then is we've got our ACES points, we've got our pubic bone down here, and then equal to that usually is going to be the great trochanter, which usually sits about even with the pubic bone or maybe a little bit lower depending on the person. But we can kind of follow that around and say like, okay, that's going to sit probably about here around the bottom of the box. And then from there we can come in and start connecting things up, right? So there's the inguinal ligament, which is going to go from the ACES point down to our pubic bone, right? It's going to basically sit right in here. And notice that starts creating that little section of the pelvis where the abs drop down into there. You know, and it creates like a nice little space for them. And then the genitals, like you were saying, sit just under the pubic bone, right? Like, I mean, they can't be in the exact same place as the bone because there's a bone there. So they sit like just under here a little bit. You know, and then it just keeps getting more complicated, right? So we know that we have the sartorius that connects to our ACES point. We have the tensor fascia lata, which connects to the ACES point, and then eventually goes down and merges with the IT band. Rectus femoris actually connects at the AIIS. Is that what it is? There's another point on your pelvis. Like there's the ACES point that we can feel pretty easily, and there's another point that's actually a little bit lower, like down here. And that's where rectus femoris connects to. And then it sort of like tucks up in between the sartorius and the tensor fascia lata. On the back of the box, the sacrum, I usually keep roughly about lined up with the top of the box. And I don't know, this is kind of my thinking on the box. It was a long box explanation, but yeah, you can look up ACES. Just Google it. You'll see a whole bunch of cool pictures of ACES points. Okay, and so then knowing your anatomy for your knee is really important, right? Because I'm going in, finding the tibia, a little bit of kneecap, getting these overlaps just right to make sure they're all working, pushing a little bit of a straight in here for the tendon that's dropping down from the back of the leg. And then we can go in there and just kind of add the calf popping out from behind. Right, kind of comes out this way and then links back into here. Comes out this way, kind of links back into here, down to our ankle. Just gonna sit here. Ankle is high on the inside, low on the outside, right? Sits at like an angle, right? Kind of like that.
some more questions for you here.
Okay.
So Ryden says thank you.
You're welcome.
And then Isaiah says, so pertaining to knees and when legs do that and not having anything in the background to pull perspective lines from, what would you say is the best method for getting that perspective or getting the feet to feel planted?
Think of the feet as a box, right? And in this case, like these feet aren't particularly tough. I don't know. Like all I'm doing right here with these is like I just drew one that I thought looked right. And then I just used some plumb lines and look at the reference and made sure they kind of lined up, judge the angle properly. With feet like this, that's enough. But really, what I would usually do with a more complex foot shape, especially with feet going away from you, is always a challenge, right? But say we have maybe like some leg gesture coming in here, and maybe we get a foot. And what I'll do is basically think of it as a box, right? We'll get kind of some of this gesture on here. And then I'll think like, okay, now let's just flatten out the back of the heel and literally treat it like a box. Right? I'm literally drawing a box, as simple as that. And yeah, like it might not conform to the perspective perfectly because like you're saying, we don't have a background. We don't know exactly where the horizon line is here. We don't know exactly, but usually if you're familiar enough with drawing boxes, and you've drawn a million of them, you can usually draw something that feels solid, right? And feels planted on the ground. And it's that boxy shape that does that. So I'll usually start with kind of that boxy shape and then go in and modify it to become more foot-like. And then it should feel relatively planted on the ground. And you're right, like we could take the time to find a background and work out like if you want to get really technical, right? Like we could work out, figure out where the horizon line is. And then we could draw like a little box on the ground that would have like, I can find a way to do this. We could say like, here's our horizon line and we're going to have this coming out from here, right? And actually draw, and this is actually do this in my foot drawing class a little bit, right? And actually work out like some perspective and then turn this into our box. And actually figure out like, say here's the base of the foot. And then start building on it and saying like, well, okay, now we get this kind of like wedge type shape on top of it and just kind of keep going until it kind of like turns into a foot. That's fine. We could do it that way. It would be very technically accurate. What's up?
There's another part of the question that I think maybe I missed
Oh,
earlier.
okay.
So Isaiah also added, or to simplify the question, do you work your way through the figures utilizing a combination of sight to size and angle sides?
That's usually what I do. So yeah, it's usually like a combination of the two, right? So I'll work through the figure, and when I'm doing like the gesture stage, like that initial gesture that I put down, what I'm doing usually is just looking at the reference and just judging angles for the bottom of the feet as best I can, right? And then when I go into the next stage, when we move into structure and I start kind of building up those like three-dimensional forms a little bit more, then I'll go in and do this, right? Like I don't really start with that. It starts with something more like this, right? Just like a simple gesture. And then, and like this foot's a little bit awkward because we're not seeing a ton of depth on it in the first place. So I wouldn't even take the time to go in and turn that into a box necessarily. But we could, I guess. It'd be kind of a flat box. Something kind of like that. guess I did make it into a box. I guess that's it. We're just looking at it from the side, so there's not much to it. Yeah, and then usually once I get into that structure phase, then I'll build up that boxy form a little bit more, work out the perspective, and it really just depends on the pose. To be honest, in this pose, I don't think it's that important, right? Like we have this foot coming right at us, which is, I mean, you have to know how to draw that, but there's not like, it's not like super complicated, you know? It's just like a wedge type shape coming out at us, you know? And so then it's just a matter of like, how long do you make that shape? You know, and we can just kind of play around with it, and I can make it a little longer, a little shorter, and then just pick the one that looks right. But there are feet and poses where it becomes really important to get the perspective. Let's see if I can find one. Oh my God, I got too many drawings in here. This is kind of important, right? Because this is a pose where, you know, he's doing some crazy stuff, and he, you know, he's like, he needs to feel planted on the ground, right? And so I went in and kind of found those boxy shapes, and this was just like a quick 20-minute drawing, but I would start with those little boxy shapes and then go in and modify them to look more like feet as needed. But like I'm essentially just looking at the perspective in the photo and saying like, okay, that foot's just kind of turned and is going away from us, and then we just try and get it to match. And to be honest, it doesn't even need to match the reference so much as it needs to feel right in the drawing is the important part. Because there's also like photographic distortion that occurs in all these photos. And, you know, ultimately what's important is that the drawing looks right, you know? And man. Oh, this is a good example. This was actually a different live stream, right? Here's one where like I need that foot to feel planted on the ground, but it's like lifting up at the same time. So I kind of worked out that boxy shape to get it planted on the ground, and then sort of went back in and designed the foot around it, you know? Same thing here. We're only seeing a tiny bit of that foot, but it needs to feel like it's like pressed up against something, right? And that's where that boxy shape kind of comes in. I talk about this a lot more. I'm teaching a foot class next term. I don't know. Hopefully that answers your question. I don't know if it did or not. What's that say? Is the box of the pelvis the same size as the head? No. Not really. Depends, I guess if you're talking about height, maybe. But it depends on the person, right? Because the box size varies from person to person. Some people have very wide and like narrow, like wide but not tall hips. Some people have hips that are like taller and more narrow. So that varies quite a bit. I think I'm looking at the skeleton right now, and yeah, like that skeleton I have kind of looks like the height of the pelvis is pretty similar to the height of the skull. But I wouldn't count on that. I think that's something that's going to vary a lot from person to person. So, yeah, I don't know. That's kind of the idea. And I'm running out of stuff to draw. What was I working on? Oh, this leg.
Adam says that he is going to submit something if we do this again.
Okay.
And thank you for the stream.
You're welcome. And cool. Yeah, we'll do, I mean, every now and then we'll do these like critique type streams, and you're always welcome to submit something. Yeah.
It seems like a lot of people showed up for this time too. The time worked well for
That's good.
a lot of people.
How many people do we have? I guess you got to look at the other one probably.
Oh yeah, I gotta look. Here, I'll look at
whatever.
my laptop.
We'll figure it out later.
Right now, 12. But over the couple hours, it's been quite a few people, I think, watching.
Good.
We're at about the 2-hour mark, just to get.
Okay, I'm pretty much done. I'm going to draw the rest of this leg. Again, this is another example, right? Knowing that anatomy is going to be really helpful, because like when you look at the reference there, it's not super clear what's going on in this area. Like, if I were to draw this, like if I were just kind of learning and somebody was like, draw this leg, I'd have no idea what's going on there. That would be super confusing, you know, and that's why, you know, anatomy studies become really important. Because now I'm thinking about, well, I know the sartorius runs through here and kind of wraps around and connects to the tibia down in here. And I can use that to kind of help create more overlaps, right? And so now we have hamstring back behind there, sartorius coming through, wrapping around, and then the calf coming from behind that sartorius section right there. You know, and then it all just kind of like locks together in a way that hopefully has some depth to it by using those overlaps properly. It's kind of the idea. Got the other ankle kind of right out here. And that's pretty much it. Well, actually, no. It looks a little bit odd because we don't have this other arm. Looks like she only has one arm. It's a little bit of a problem. One thing I will say is a lot of this went pretty well, right? Like I'm adding more information into the knees and stuff, but generally speaking, the proportions are all pretty good, except for this arm up here. It's feeling very small and pinching kind of awkwardly in here. So we're gonna need to figure out how to change that up a little bit and see if we can come in here and get, I'm gonna start with like the forearm up here, which starts about eye level maybe. Kind of comes out this way. I'm gonna push it straight in there again because I know that anatomy and I know there's a bone in there. And the ulna specifically, the ulna is like very straight bone, you know, we can use that to our advantage. And the bottom part I think needs to start lower. Kind of come out this way. Right, so we get kind of a bigger arm out there. And then the gesture we want to keep nice and even, right? We don't want it to like pinch, you know, this looks almost like a little balloon or something out there, you know, because it's kind of like pinched on each side. So we want to avoid that, at least at first. In the gesture stage, we want to avoid that. And when we add the anatomy back in, I don't know, a little bit of that could pop up, but be good to avoid it, right? And then we get the rest of the forearm here, and then we can add a little bit of the flexors kind of poking out on this side a little bit. That didn't look great. Let's try that again. It's very subtle. It's not, in fact, on her, it's almost non-existent. And then we get some elbow kind of popping out here. That's not bad. I think that works okay. And his arm's kind of coming out towards us a bit. It's kind of doing this, I think. And then we get this part, of course, going away from us. Kind of like that. And then this part up here also going away from us a lot. You know, thinking about those three-dimensional forms underneath there. Add a little bit more elbow on here. And this actually keeps going. And then her hand is kind of like out here, actually. It's a little bit awkward without the hair, because there's, you know, a whole bunch of hair in there, so The drawing is looking a little bit different from the reference. Cool. Anyway, that's pretty much it. That's what I would do. So, unless there's another question, I think that is it. Casey wrote, got it, thanks. You're welcome. Yeah, as far as like the box, you know, being the same size as the head, that's one of those things where like a lot of places where you study will teach you these like generic measurements, and they'll be like the head, you duplicate the head size, and then it goes down to like the sternum, and then you duplicate it again and you hit the pelvis, and you learn these like really generic things. But what's weird is like, and I tried learning some of that when I was first starting out, and what really threw me off was like that only works when people are standing up like perfectly straight. And as soon as somebody bends a little bit, none of those measurements matter anymore. It just throws everything off. And so then it's like, well, why do you take the time? Like, it's pretty rare that you're going to have to draw somebody standing perfectly straight up with their arms straight. I mean, that's not going to happen because it's not dynamic looking at all. And so, in my opinion, like taking the time to really learn all those measurements and stuff was never all that helpful. To me, like learning more like comparative type measurement and working from reference when you're starting out so you can kind of know when something looks right and when it doesn't, and kind of training yourself to figure that out and studying some perspective and learning like some foreshortening is way more helpful in my opinion, rather than trying to learn all those little like generic measurements, you know? Because like what happens? Like, yeah, we could say, okay, the head's the same size as the pelvis, but then what happens if the head's tilted down a little bit? You know, or what happens if she's like leaned back and now there's a bunch of perspective on the pelvis, but the head's leaned forward? Like that measurement just goes right out the window the second she does almost anything, you know? And yeah, I don't know. That's been my approach, at least. And like studying some of that stuff, it's good in the sense that it helps train your brain to recognize proportions and like to judge distances and things like that. But when it comes to actually drawing a figure, I've never found them super helpful personally. It's not to say that they aren't. I mean, a lot of people learn that stuff, so maybe it's just me. That's totally a possibility. But in my opinion, that's the case. Anyway, this is the end. What does that say? It's good for beginners.
Did you see the pelvis with cylinders?
No.
Comment? Okay, this is from Isaiah.
Do you ever draw the pelvis with cylinders?
Yeah.
Depends on the pose, but usually not. I don't know why. I've always found the boxy shape for the hip to be really helpful, partly because it's such like a three-dimensional structure. And I spent a ton of time drawing boxes early on. And so I have an easy time just manipulating that box and doing what I needed to do. A cylinder can work. I mean, I've seen people draw good drawings starting with cylinders, so it's not like it's impossible. It's more just like a personal preference thing and how you learn. And in my opinion, like the anatomy fits and attaches to the box a lot better than it would a cylinder. But that's probably because that's how I've been drawing them for a really long time. And I'm not as familiar with the cylinder approach. I'm trying to think. Somewhere I had some cylinder stuff I drew actually recently as part of a critique. I don't know if I can find it. Got like a million critiques on the floor here next to me. I've been teaching a hands class, so I've been drawing a lot of hand things this last term. Another hand, more hands, okay, I don't know where it went, but somewhere I had a torso that I drew as a cylinder, and the reason I did it, like it had a specific purpose in the critique, is because I was talking about basically perspective and like how when you're looking at these photos, you have to really be aware of like what height is the camera at when you're looking at the figure. And I usually try to take the photos from roughly waist height, kind of. And so then the effect is when you look at this photo, we're looking up at her in the top half of the photo and we're looking down at her in the bottom half of the photo. And so I did a whole critique where I kind of drew like a cylinder person. And so you could see like how all the lines kind of change and wrap around as the perspective of the camera changes. I don't know what happened to it though. I was going to show it to you, but I don't know. It's probably in that giant pile of critiques back behind me. Yeah, anyway.
The last question was, or comment, was from Nivad, who says it's good for beginners, but eventually you have to conceptualize more measurement observations.
I would agree with that. Yeah, when it comes to like the, learning those generic measurements, I would agree. Like as a beginner, it's good just to help train your brain to kind of learn proportion. But in my opinion, it's not super helpful beyond that, because then, like I said, as soon as anybody does anything, those measurements don't really work anymore. Which is a little frustrating when you spend a bunch of time learning all those measurements.
Let's see. Nivad, he also said that he joined at the very end.
Yeah.
And then he said, like Schwarzenegger in The Terminator, I'll be back.
Nice.
That was my best Arnold impression.
Not the best, but
hey,
you got the idea.
Okay, it wasn't great.
Yeah.
And then he says that, Isaiah says thank you. And Nivad says, the old never-ending Loomis critique conversation. Yeah.
Yep. Loomis, that guy has injected himself into every art drawing for all eternity, I think. Yeah, Loomis is cool. I don't know. There's things about Loomis I like. I mean, literally, I have all these books back here behind me. And in every single one of them, I would say there's things that I like and things that I use and things that I don't. Same with Loomis, same with Bridgman. I mean, it's not like these guys were perfect, like they had some good ideas and they had a few that I disagree with. That's the way it goes. I'm sure there's plenty of people that look at my drawings and disagree with plenty of it. So, yeah, I don't know. I think this is the end. We're done. Thank you guys for watching. I appreciate it. I will see you next time. And goodbye.
Bye, everyone.
Goodbye.